Good afternoon, everyone. This is Edward Jones, Director of Programs for APFI. I'd like to welcome you to our third Thursday webinar. This one is titled Building a Strong Infrastructure for Black Civic Engagement and Political Giving. We're really excited about hosting this webinar as it ties back to a great emerging partnership with Bill Snowden Foundation and a number of other organizations, a growing list of organizations that are involved with the Black Social Change Funders Network. So as part of this learning experience, we are really thrilled around the growing momentum in engaging funders, whether you're an individual funder or a foundation or just someone that wants to give back, into building a stronger Black civic engagement network. And this work and the great dynamic panel that you're about to hear is here to help tell you and help you be more strategic in how you engage in Black political infrastructure and the work. I have with me today, I'll introduce to you, is Terrence Pitts, who is the program director for this new enterprise. And so take it away, Terrence. Talk a little bit about this Black Social Change Funders Network.
Great. Thank you, Edward, for the introduction. And good afternoon, everyone. The Black Social Change Funders Network is as it sounds, it's a funders network and affinity group that was started as a project of APFI and the Bill Snowden Foundation. And the ambition of the funders network is to really help create a powerful and robust and sustainable Black-led infrastructure and ecosystem for Black social change. We know that there are lots of funders out there doing work helping to support the ecosystem and for Black social change. And this network is really a vehicle to bring funders together, to act more strategically, to think strategically, to develop strategies that will help strengthen the way that we do our grant making, so we can essentially strengthen the infrastructure for Black communities. In particular, we want to increase the strategic investment in our ecosystem for Black-led social change, and specifically for institutional, political, and economic power. And some of the vehicles that the Funders Network is targeting are specifically looking at developing and cultivating an interest to advance a framework for the importance and support for Black-led social change. So how do we actually create a theory of change around Black-led social change, and how do we get that theory of change out in the ecosystem, out among funders, and have folks talking about it? And then how do we really help our network build capacity within the network to be good grant makers and to really advocate and make the case internally within philanthropy to support Black-led social change. We know it's not, as funders and grant makers, it's not always easy to leverage funding to support Black-led social change. So we really would like to help create a community and a learning environment that arms us with resources and materials to help make that case and argument to our boards, program directors, and governance body within philanthropy. And then finally, part of this vision of the Funders Network is to really engage in what we call strategic co-funding. We know that the power of philanthropy is really amplified when we come together collectively and bring our dollars together and collaborate on funding strategies. So how can we, the many funders out there in the U.S. kind of working on these issues that are not always aligned, how can we come together to align our grant making more strategically, and even look at coordinated grant making and potentially pooled grant making that really focuses on Black-led social change. So that's sort of a brief overview of the vision of the network, and we hope that many of you will continue to be engaged in the network's activities in the future. With that being said, I'd love to introduce Cietta Kiandoli, who is the director of the Black Civic Engagement Fund at the Democracy Alliance. Cietta,
yep.
It's all yours.
Hey, thanks. Can folks hear me? Terrence, can you guys hear me? Just want to make sure.
Yes. Yep,
okay, perfect. All right. So thank you so much to AbbVie, for Edward and Terrence inviting me to participate in this discussion. Before I introduce our panelists, I wanted to just give a little bit of context around the funds and the importance of this call at this time and start to frame up the discussion. And Takani, you can go to the next slide. Next one too. So the Black Civic Engagement Fund is a C3 and a C4 donor collaborative or pooled fund made up of individual donors, labor unions, and foundations that are to support this work. I think it's important for me to acknowledge that it's a C3 and C4 because very often there is not a lot of C4 funding for Black political infrastructure. And so I know we'll talk a little bit more about that throughout the call, but I wanted to address that as well up front. So we were created in 2012 to address the chronic underfunding of Black organizing and civic engagement infrastructure. And since its inception, we've granted over $8 million to local and national organizations. I think it's important also to point out that number because $8 million it's great money to move to the field, but in the context of a broader political landscape and the funding landscape, I think it's important that we'll see that, and I'll bring that up again as we talk about this election cycle. Takani, can you go to the next slide? Thanks. So we are, in fact, the only donor collaborative with the goal of building political power within the Black community to achieve transformative policy reforms that will have real impact on African Americans. Again, the only person with the sole purpose of that, and I think that's important as we think about this, not to say that there aren't other people investing in this, but in terms of the political infrastructure that's necessary, and our folks will talk about some of those challenges and what they're facing as well, but I think it's important to think about that too, and how we think as funders about different streams of funding and the way we use our institutions to be able to actually support this work long term. Takani, can you go to the next slide? And then last but not least, I wanted to talk about how we achieve that goal, and then I'm going to introduce the panelists. So we do that by mostly investing in organizing and political infrastructure, creating a steady drumbeat on the issues that matter to the Black communities, fostering a new generation of Black civic and political leadership, and then increasing Black voter participation. For today's call, though, we're just going to focus on the political infrastructure and the opportunities that you all will have to invest in the organizations that are really shifting the systems and policies in the lives of Black communities across the country. So for a little reflection on the 2016 election cycle, in 2016, we will see the most diverse electorate in the country. And nearly $2 billion will be spent in this year alone. So in the context of us regranting $8 million over the last 4 years, in this cycle alone, there will be $2 billion spent just on the election. And in every battleground state, the Black vote will be the determining outcome for progressive candidates. But the investment is not necessarily aligned with that and the actual base of the party and for our communities and progressive politics. And so how are we going to change that, right? I want to make one more statement, too, about this. Political power that we will spend lots of money this cycle does not actually start this year. And for us, infrastructure is important because it means that you're investing in 2017, in 2013. We'll be investing prior to and after this election cycle because real political power is made when you have constant streams of funding, constant infrastructure to move political programs on and off years. And that's how our folks have been really shifting the policies in their states. And we'll talk about it from both a statewide perspective, C3 and C4. We'll talk about it in terms of protest politics and how folks are moving youth vote. And then we'll have a little bit of a funder perspective as well. So that I will turn it over to the panelists, which I'm very excited about. You guys are going to hear from what I think are some of the foremost leaders in political organizing across the country. Folks that have been doing this for decades and the folks that are newer to the game but also have had incredible impact in a short amount of time. So with that, and I'm also excited because all of these folks are also folks that we regrant to and we believe in the work that they're doing across the country. So we'll start off with Anthony Thigpen, who's the leader of California Calls, to discuss his work. We'll then head to Aaron Bird, who's the executive director of Blueprint North Carolina and the founder of the Block Project. Then we'll have a national perspective from Charlene Carruthers, the national director of BYP 100, and then Ludovic Blaine, the director of the Progressive Era Project and the Color of Democracy Fund, who will talk a little bit about the funder perspective and why they have shifted their strategy. With that, I will turn it over to Anthony to lead the next section of this call.
Great, thank you, Cietta. So I'd like to make the case for investing in Black infrastructure by looking at a current project to increase the number of Black organizations working to increase Black civic participation in our communities. It's a project we're doing here in California, training and supporting 12 groups who currently don't do civic engagement work to add integrated voter engagement to their power building strategies. And the context is the increased awareness of activism around police violence and mass incarceration, declining African-American vote, which I'll talk about in a second, and the need to add a political power building aspect to the overall movement building in the Black community. Key constituencies include African-American young people, the formerly incarcerated, African-American women, and African-American immigrants. Next slide. So when we first started this project, we got a lot of questions about what's the rationale for doing an African-American project in California. And the first reason is because African-Americans continue to disproportionately suffer from discrimination and growing economic inequality, whether it's poverty, education, health care, mass incarceration. These are problems that we disproportionately suffer from. And to address these problems requires the Black community to have more power to influence the decisions that are shaping the community. Next slide. The second reason is that the African-American vote tends to be lower than the overall voter turnout. And when you look at African-American young people, you can see there's a huge gap, almost 50% gap between African-American voters who are over 65 and African-American voters who are 18 to 24. The other point is that as likely African-American voters age, they are not being replaced by younger African-American voters. So without intervention, this is going to lead to the decline of Black political power overall. Next slide. I want to say a thing about how we solve this problem. And part of it is what's called integrated voter engagement. And this speaks to what Cietta talked about earlier. It's a multi-year strategy to increase voter participation in communities and constituencies. It engages voters year-round, not just during elections, to build a relationship, educate on issues, and motivate them to increase their civic participation and become involved in other kinds of advocacy and community organizing programs. It is centered in local community-based organizations that are rooted in communities, so it doesn't disappear after any one election, and embraces integrated voter engagement as an ongoing part of the organizing strategy. A key focus of it is developing grassroots leaders, and they are the primary organizers that engage their peers in the community to increase the voter engagement. It uses voter engagement technology to increase the capacity of community-based organizations to reach a new scale in integrating voters. And it does systematic tracking and engagement of voters and tracking results with a living and growing voter database. Next slide. So how do we know this works? With California Calls, we've done this work systematically since 2009. In 2012, you can see on the chart, the overall voter turnout in California was 72%. The voter turnout among African Americans was 67%. And the voter turnout among those African American voters that are involved in the integrated voter engagement over the past 3 years was 85%. So 18% higher than their peer voters and 13% higher than overall turnout. In 2014, even though voter turnout was very low in California at 43%, African American vote overall was 36%. Again, voters involved in our programs, integrated voter engagement, turned out at 56%, 20% higher than African American voters not involved in this approach, and 13% higher than the overall electorate itself. So we've got a growing body of evidence that this integrated voter engagement works when you invest in it. Next slide. So the program is really about investing long-term in the community. This is a 3-year project. It provides core support grants, executive directive coaching, organizational development, technical assistance. So not just focusing on talking to voters, but building the capacity of organizations to do this work in an ongoing way, using state-of-the-art technology and ongoing planning, implementation, and educating. So the punchline for us is that the Black community has played an historic role in social justice movements both in California and across the country. But at the same time, the Black community still suffers disproportionately from injustices. And so we believe that investment in Black infrastructure in general, and particularly increasing participation in particular, are key to addressing these problems and moving our community from where it is right now to building the power to change people's lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. And then I'll turn it over to Aaron to talk a little bit about the work in North Carolina and then what they're building as well.
Is Aaron on? Can we hear you, Aaron?
She's definitely on. I'm not sure if we can hear her.
Okay, while we wait for Aaron dial, go ahead.
I was going to say we can, while Aaron is trying to call in, we could shift to Charlene. I did hear Charlene a little earlier.
Hi, I'm here. This is Charlene.
Okay. All right. Hey. We're being flexible here. So, Charlene, I'd love to hear from you talk about Black Youth Project 100 and the work that you've been doing over the last couple of years.
Great. Thank you so much for having us on the call today. My name is Charlene Carruthers, and I'm the National Director of BYP 100. We are a national organization of young Black activists between the ages of 18 and 35, and we have chapters from as far west as the Bay Area, as far east as New York, and as far south as New Orleans in Louisiana. And so what we do, our work has 3 pillars. Direct action campaign organizing, public policy advocacy, and also building electoral power through civic engagement. We wrap that up in 2 bowls, transformative leadership development and also operating through a Black queer feminist lens, which essentially says that we believe that none of us are free until all of us are free. And so for us, we work with young Black folks who have at best a tenuous relationship with the state or the government. And in 2014, 2014 gave us our first opportunity to engage in electoral politics in a primarily C3, on a primarily a C3 level. And so we launched our GLTV project in 3 states, in Michigan, Illinois, and North Carolina, called I'm Young, I'm Black, and I Vote. And the focus was that we're not here to talk about candidates. We're here to push a very clear agenda, policy agenda specifically around ending mass criminalization and mass incarceration in the country. And so what we did very simply is that we recruited young Black folks who were working already in these in communities in Detroit, Chicago, Greensboro, and Charlotte, and who didn't have the resources to do the work paid and have access to certain pieces of infrastructure. And we let them hire their teams. And we supported them through trainings and other just technical support. And that year we had direct contacts with about 10,000 registered voters between the ages of 18 and 35 within Black communities. And so we learned a lot from that experience. And if I can go to the next slide. Some of the things we learned is that, there has to be a convergence of field and direct action strategies, and that is definitely it's possible first, and it's also necessary to engage young Black activists who are doing the work in this moment. Folks are coming into this moment with a righteous rage and a righteous anger around the various state-supported and state-sanctioned institutions that are complicit in poverty, mass incarceration, gendered violence, and so on. Also, it was clear to us that risk-taking was central in this time of deep uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen, and we can't always determine our next steps and our moves on who's going to be elected, be it from the White House to the local school board. We still have to do this work no matter what, without being, we're not fortune tellers. So we do know what our folks have experienced, what we are experiencing, and if we don't do something about it, where we could go. We also learned in 2014 that young black folks are poised to actually advance policy agendas and shift dominant narratives. And we're seeing that even more clearly in 2016. Most recently, our organization, alongside a number of other organizations and folks in the city of Chicago, ran both C3 and C4 level work around the Cook County State's Attorney's race, in which State Attorney Anita Alvarez was defeated and unseated. We didn't support any candidate. We didn't endorse a candidate, and it's not because, you know, we were worried about our tax status. We did it because we believe that our power is better situated when we're very clear about the issues and what our policy agenda is, as opposed to focusing on a candidate, because, you know, there are no permanent friends and no permanent enemies, and these things shift. So we really wanted to situate our power in a way of saying that this person has not worked. Not only has this person not worked, but this person holds too much power over our lives. And this whole office holds too much power over our lives, and this is actually the kind of community and world we want to live in, where we divest from the prison nation that we live in and invest in black futures. And so it's really, really important to have local leadership at the forefront of this work that is connected to a national infrastructure. Can I have the next slide, please? So how we learned it again is that we ran a 3-state GOTV program in 2014 as you see, North Carolina, Michigan, and Illinois, and also through the Cook County State's Attorney primary. And we learned, there was so much that we learned. And some of it, it's not planned. We didn't know that the video of the execution of Laquan McDonald by Officer Van Dyke would be released on November 24th. In the thick of folks organizing around this primary, the state's attorney primary. But we had to respond. And unfortunately, the funding field is not always structured to respond to those rapid response moments. I do think that there are some notable institutions, notable foundations who absolutely are building out rapid response funds, be it Proteus through their work and some of the affiliates that they work with, and other funds that exist. But overall, the field is not necessarily set up to respond to moments. And that's what we need to make sure that our work is sustainable. And it's not just about getting folks out on the street after a video was released. It's also absolutely about how do we bring those young people into a leadership pipeline. And for us, like BYP 100, we have a membership structure and a membership recruitment structure. And so we want to bring folks into that. But we don't have full-time organizers in all of our chapters. And I can imagine that if we did have that, the amount of capacity that we would actually be able to build. And, you know, flexibility is important. And we realized very early on that we needed to have both a C3 and a C4 entity because political work was important to us. And knowing that still the majority of our work absolutely fits more squarely into a C3 bucket. But there's not too often that you see young black people being unapologetic about and very well versed in a political agenda that is not hinged on a party or on a set of candidates or any candidate. And so that's what's important to us and how we really see ourselves moving forward in this work. And second. And so we've learned a lot about if we can go to the next slide, please. So where we're going across the ecosystem, and when I refer to the ecosystem, BYP 100 is not the only organization doing this work. It's very, very clear. We are in partnership with a number of organizations, be it the Black Lives Matter Network, Project South, a host of local organizations across the country as well. And we are really, really interrogating this question and also diving into the practices of building independent Black political power and what that even means and what that looks like. And then secondly, investing resources in the South. All too often, people use the skills and the knowledge and the history and the legacy of Black organizing in the South. And today, the investments are nowhere near where they should be. And so we work in we currently have chapters in North Carolina and in Louisiana, and we're looking to build in other spaces in the South. But we're not the only ones, and there are people who've been there for a long time, be it Southerners on New Ground, again, Project South, and other entities that need support. And if they win, we win. BYP 100 wins when an organization, like we all win, and Black people win ultimately. And then third, we're moving into, excuse me, deep integration of direct action and electoral organizing to win policy victories. Our folks are understanding the power that the state has over our lives, and we're not simply interested in reforming the system. That's great. We have to have reforms along the way. We want to get to a point where the changes that we're making are transformative. And so that's where I think we're going, where I believe we're going, and we're absolutely going at that with a number of folks across the ecosystem.
Thank you so much, Charlene. Do we have Aaron now?
Can you hear me?
Yes. All right, technology's up and running again. So I want to turn it over now to Aaron Bird to talk a little bit about Blueprint North Carolina and the block project that they're building.
And before Aaron speaks, I just want to remind everyone that there is a question and answer on the right side that we want to invite you to pose your questions. We will get to a moment where we will field those questions as part of this dialogue. So take it away, Aaron. Glad to have you with us.
And we have a little room too, so Edward, if it looks like it's getting, there's some urgent questions, just let me know and I will pause after Aaron speaks to start to address those.
Awesome, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for allowing me to join this call. Can you go to the next slide for me, please, ma'am? So I'm with Blueprint North Carolina, and we are one of the we're the C3 table in North Carolina. One of the things that is really important to us is the role of collective impact and race equity that informs all of our work, and those are our core operating principles. And I start there because we have a explicit goal of building leadership in communities of color and among young people. Our board is majority Black and really working very hard to sort of diversify in other areas in terms of age and sexual orientation. But specifically, one of the things that Blueprint has done is to focus investment on building infrastructure among African American and Black community, and I'll talk a little bit about those specific strategies a little later. Our big areas of work are obviously going to be civic engagement. I think Anthony did a real strong assessment of integrated voter engagement and its importance and its relationship to base building. I'd also name in that shifting the dialogue about the role of government and centering the experiences of people of color in and their experiences with government as we're trying to make that shift, strengthening skills, and then innovation. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. One of the things that makes race equity, and particularly centering Black struggle in our work, is the fact that we are in a fight against the new Confederacy in the South. And I said, in their 40-year strategy to really keep their foot on our necks means that for us to do work, our messaging, our organizing, all of our work has to be rooted in an understanding of how racism is playing out in the South. And there are a number of stories that I don't have time to tell. But specifically, this question of voter suppression directly impacts the Black community, and all of and you can go to the next slide, and I can say I mean, a lot of people have heard the story, but essentially one of the attacks is, cutting early voting, cutting Sunday voting, cutting same-day voter registration, and just one slide here to show that while a total share of the North Carolina voters are African American, almost 40% of us are using early voting or using Sunday voting and that type of thing. So they have that assessment, and then so they're attacking us at the sort of at the root. You can go to the next slide for me, please. I think one of the other things that I wanted to name, why is Blueprint playing this particular position in this moment, is the real challenge in building and strengthening, I want to say in building Black-led infrastructure. We have a history of a fight back in our state, but one of the things that's challenging is a lot of the Black-led organizations are volunteer-based operations, so they don't have full-time staff, and so then they are it's hard for them to connect with the progressive infrastructure, quote unquote, where a majority of the funding is flowing. So if we meet as an example during the day and people are working, it's, you know, we need to figure out how we build those relationships more directly. And then also at a high level, a lot of the resources sort of directed for organizing in North Carolina, and I'm assuming maybe across the country, but particularly in North Carolina, are invested into organizations that are not led by people of color, or not led by African Americans in particular. And the fact that we're one of the least unionized states in the country means that the investment in base building and increasing the capacity of community-led organizations is a critical role that has to be played. Next slide. One of the things that we have done is build out a couple of different and really important projects, and these are base building and leadership development strategies. The Black Women's Roundtable, which is co-convened by Spirit House, which is a Black woman-led organization that focuses on cultural organizing, so it's rooted in resilience and healing, and bringing forward our culture. And the issues that it is most focused on is economic justice, building political power, and sort of health and healing in our communities. And we think that by using that as a strategy in our organizing, then we'll be able to bring more sisters into that work and build our capacity to move forward an agenda that benefits Black women and Black communities and Black families. The other really important piece of work is the Black Organizing, Leadership and Organizing Collective, and there are groups like the Beloved Community Center, the A. Philip Randolph Institute, Tribe, the Queer People of Color Alliance, that are part of this organizing collective. And our desire is to figure out building long-term statewide Black infrastructure that is connected around sharing brain power, connected around advancing Black liberation, connected around healing in our communities, and operating with an ethic that's around unity and not division. So we've set out a series of what our commitments are, and the Black Civic Engagement Fund in its genius has given us planning money, so it's not tied to make this number of door knocks or make this number of calls. It's tied to take some time and figure out what you need and what it's going to take to build long-term sustainable infrastructure that moves a Black agenda. And that is what we need. We need funds that give us some time for space and for developing strategy. And then for us, this we also have an ongoing base building program that is designed to help us collectively build our membership base and advance equity. And so it's a local campaign in Raleigh, North Carolina on police accountability, and it's using the resources like the SMS text messaging and summer series on organizing strategy, and really trying to figure out how do you bring folks into process and move them together through the ladder of engagement, and really tracking that. So those are some of the strategies that we're trying to use to build out the capacity of community-based Black-led organizations in North Carolina. And one of the reasons this is, and I sort of already talked about why it's so important in this moment. So again, thank you so much for the opportunity to share some of our work.
Thank you so much, Erin. I don't know, Edward or Takani and Terrence, do we need to pause for a second? Or can we move to Ludovic?
Sure. Takani, are there any questions in the queue?
Not as yet, no.
Okay. Alrighty.
As a reminder to everyone, feel free to pose your questions in the question chat box, which is on the right.
Sorry.
Pardon?
Sorry, we do have a couple of questions, actually. Someone's asking if they can get a copy of the PowerPoint. Yes, all of this will be on the APFI website, and you should be able to download it in the handout section of the GoToMeeting panel as well.
Thank you. Is there a second question?
That is it so far.
Okay, thank you.
This is Tam. So just add one more thing. We invite everyone also to join us on social media at Black Social Change, and that's CHNG. Just if you'd like to kind of start the conversation or share the conversation or thoughts you may have about the webinar on Twitter or Facebook, please use that handle. Thank you.
We just got another question, actually. One of the participants is curious around how many people are engaged in each of these organizations or campaigns. They want to know whether we are talking about hundreds of folks or thousands of people. Like, what's the general number across the work that you all are doing?
In terms of each of the organizations? Or
it's not clear, so if the person who asked the question could clarify, that would be great, but I think that they're referring to sort of like Black Youth Project, as well as the work that Anthony is doing, and of course Aaron as well.
Okay. What do you think it makes sense for us to get clarity while we're getting clarity to move to Ludovic so we can wrap up and then have a more robust discussion about what folks are building and the reach of each of their programs, which is significant in most of the states?
That sounds good. We can advance to Ludovic's presentation.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. Ludovic Blaine, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Great. Can folks hear me?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So I'm Ludovic Blaine. I direct two of California's progressive donor tables. The first is called the Color of Democracy Fund, which is a nonpartisan 501c3 entity, as well as the Progressive Era Project, which is a political entity. Both are backed by some of California's leading progressive individual donors and state labor unions. Our goal is to bring about another progressive era in California by investing in progressive communities of color. And as you all, I'm sure, know, California's majority people of color, and campaigns, whether they're policy, initiative, or electoral campaigns, can be easily lost by having a strategy that's too white, and can be functionally won by strategies that lean heavily on intersectional investments in progressive communities of color. So first, thanks for going to that slide. So my investments aren't solely directed in Black communities, but obviously they include Black communities. And I'm going to talk about politics, little p and big P politics. What Charlene mentioned before, a lot of Black political investments are either party related or directly candidate related. There's very little African American progressive partisan infrastructure, so infrastructure that does partisan work. In fact, there's very little people of color progressive partisan work. This group that the slide is up, it's called Color PAC. It's a progressive people of color PAC in Oregon. So first, as from California, which is a big state with lots of people of color, I've used Color PAC as a way to encourage and inspire folks of color, including African Americans in California. Essentially, if Oregon can do it, we can too. I agree that we need Black political infrastructure that's not tied or following a party or a candidate. We need our own independent progressive infrastructure, both as Black folks and grouped together with people of color. Next slide. And there's some steps that people are taking in that direction. So first, I just wanted to spotlight Color PAC because neither New York nor California have racial justice PACs like Oregon does. And again, if what folks are doing on the webinar is the same as what folks have said to me in person, they usually say, really? Wait, Oregon has a racial justice people of color PAC? Really? Oregon does? So I just wanted to spotlight them. If it's possible in Oregon, it's possible elsewhere. Next slide. Great. Another people of color political organization is Power PAC. Again, this is not African American focused, but it does include African American donors and strategies around African Americans, as well as having a thrust in having a Southern strategy to build, strengthen, and support Black political infrastructure in the South. Why I'm talking about the political partisan infrastructure is that too often the racial justice folks, including African Americans, are on the C3 side of work, meaning nonpartisan work, where we are engaging communities, doing integrated voter engagement, helping turn out voters with a progressive lens. But then on the political side, we are not actually there, whether it's choosing candidates, running the candidate campaigns, making sure that when candidates are running, they're actually running not just from within our community, not away from, but from within our community, both as individuals and with their policy platforms. And so we do need to build Black infrastructure across tax statuses. So whenever we need to have a campaign, we need to be able to have the tax status that allows us to do that campaign. Next slide. This is from Steve Phillips' book, Brown is the New White. And here, while African Americans are not pulled out of the numbers, when we're looking at what it actually takes to win elections nationally, so this is different state by state, and in many states the number of people of color are higher. In a state like California, the slice of progressive would be much bigger. But you look at what it actually takes to win elections, and what usually happens on the political side is that there's white donors making investments in white candidates who make investments in white consultants, and those white consultants chase, assume that they're going to get votes from the progressive whites, that 28%, and then chase the other whites in the 43%. Now those other whites, their policy preferences stoked by dog whistle, and at this point not even dog whistle racism by at least 1.5 of the major parties, do not want to be in coalition with the progressive people of color. So when those white donors who are investing in white candidates, who invest in white political consultants, work to unify the other whites with the progressive whites, we get at best both messaging and campaigns that don't address any part of racial justice, and very often they're racist. Another strategy would be moving towards that new American majority, combining a minority of those whites that are actually progressive or liberal with the majority of people of color and getting to 51%. And so this is, so if you're interested more in this, you should read, next slide. Oh, okay, we missed that slide, but you should read Steve Phillips' book, Brown is the New White. On the conservative side, you can see here that too often, even when they have Black political entities, they're actually backed by and sometimes staffed by white folks. And so we have a blackface with white donor money behind it, pushing very conservative and anti-Black policies and candidates. So that happens, we know, on the conservative side, but it also sometimes happens on the, and it's a bit contradictory to say, but liberal or progressive sides as well. And so our focus on working to build people of color generally, and including Black progressive political infrastructure, is so that at any point in the work, depending on what's needed, that there's progressive Black folks who have community constituencies and are doing integrated voter engagement that can apply that people power, whether it's through protests, rallies, community actions, or voting, can apply that kind of work, whether it's in a C3 context, an initiative context, or a direct partisan context. And we need to be building that infrastructure. I know most of the folks on this call focus on the C3 work. Building robust C3 infrastructure is key because much of the time C4 and partisan infrastructure is built on the lessons learned and the capacities built on the C3 side. And I'd say that in California, it's been very hard to build a Black political infrastructure because of the very small scale of the Black C3 infrastructure. And so I'm very appreciative for Anthony's project building the Black C3 infrastructure. And we hope to be then, as those groups are capacities are built out, that we can then help them build the political piece of that infrastructure. Is there a next slide? Okay. So again, I hope that those of you that are able to fund on the C3 side do that, build integrated voter engagement capacity in Black infrastructure around the country, and making sure not to ignore the South or California. But then the few of you on the call who either through your own individual giving capacity or with the donors that you might be engaging can make sure that they have an aligned political strategy that is not just giving to whatever are the Black candidates running, but that's actually focused on building permanent, independent, Black progressive political infrastructure, so that rather than following the Black candidates, we can actually have community leaders moving forward and having candidates follow them. So thanks, and I'll pass it back to Cietta.
Thanks so much, Ludovic. So thanks to all the panelists for being really clear and also giving us a lot of information before jumping into a discussion around the possibilities for investment, answering some of the questions that folks on the phone might have. So with that, I will ask Takani and Edward, are there questions that we should start following up with and addressing, and I can moderate that next step.
Okay, we can go back to that initial question around how many people are engaged in each of these organizations or campaigns. The person who asked the question has clarified not necessarily campaigns, but efforts. Are we talking about hundreds of folks or thousands? So I guess they want to understand the scale of the work that some of you are doing.
Do you want to start off, Anthony?
Sure. California Calls is an ongoing alliance of 31 organizations in 12 counties of California. We typically have several thousand people doing canvassing and phoning in our voter engagement work. Currently, our current base, we've identified 625,000 predominantly people of color supporters that we work to turn out to vote.
And Aaron and then Charlene.
In regards to scale, where we were in 2014 and where we are in 2016 is slightly different. We were talking at least volunteers and organizers within less than or around 100 folks between the 3 states. And in 2016, we'll be in 10 states, 10 cities across the country, and so that number will absolutely go up in regards to how many volunteers and leaders and paid organizers are engaged in the overall work. I definitely will say BYP 100, we're coming up on our 3rd year, and so we definitely are trying not to scale out quicker than what is like healthy and even like healthy for an organization, for a young organization, but we're talking, within the low hundreds of people who will be engaged in 2016 as actual volunteers and paid folks in the work. But the people that we're talking about touching, those are in the tens of thousands.
Thanks.
So this is Erin Bird. Blueprint is a collaborative of about 43 organizations. And then within the Black Women's Roundtable effort, we have been working together for about a year, and there are almost 200 women in that network with a leadership team of about 25 women. And then within the block, the Black Leadership and Organizing Collective, there are a number of different organizations that have different scales. So as an example, the A. Philip Randolph Institute organizes in 45 counties. The Beloved has really a deep network in just Greensboro. So there's a mix. We do also a Get Out the Vote program and a voter registration program. So this year we're registering about 80,000 voters. And our GOTV program will attempt to reach a little over 1 million voters, of which 75% of them approximately would be African American. And I think we have, all of us probably have more detail on our work that we can share if you approach us.
Yep. And what I would say too, thanks folks, the reach and scale is definitely depends on the life cycle of the organization. So with the Black Civic Engagement Fund and the Action Fund, with the newer projects that we are building and trying to figure out capacity across the country, they're being really strategic, and they have smaller contact programs and smaller staff. And then folks develop skill set and become more strategic, gain more capacity, like Charlene said, in terms of like being smart about their growth, also understanding how the funding cycle works, particularly for organizations that are led by Black folks. They're building out very slowly, much more slowly, and then also they don't have as large a staff. So I think it depends on the state, and I think it depends on the investment over time.
Great. So we have another question. Someone said that the Black voters would be the margin of victory in battleground states. What is the source of that data point? Is there an effort to publicize that to have funding more aligned to increase Black civic engagement?
Yeah, that was actually based off of targeting information that this is Cietta, that we received in alignment with SEIU, and a lot of the work that they're doing in terms of political organizing. And it has been publicized. We've shown it in terms of the vote share growth across the country. Not necessarily, it hasn't necessarily picked up steam, but yes, in most of the battleground states, we have all of the vote share growth. In fact, I have that for each of the targeted states that we're working in and what the margin of victory would be in terms of turnout, right? So, for instance, in Florida, if folks don't turn out at the highest levels that they've ever turned out in, the Black voters don't turn out at the highest levels they've ever turned in, so that's actually like 2012 and 2008 levels, the state flips. I mean, the state goes, is lost to the progressive candidate. But yes, I can share that with folks as well, and the map of all of the states that we're doing work in.
Okay. Next question. Why is the Black vote taken for granted, particularly evidenced by the dearth of funding for Black civic engagement infrastructure, and what can be done about it?
Ludovic? Or
yeah, sure. I'd say first, Black infrastructure is ignored, whether it's organizing, service, or direct political infrastructure. I would say the real answer is racism and white supremacy. I mean, that's the basis of it. There's also the racial, and a part of that is the racial wealth gap. So people of color in general and Black folks in particular don't have the wealth to be able to philanthropically support us individually from large donations. So we have to make that money from smaller donations. And then given that once you even move past C3 work where you get a tax deduction and you go to political work, you actually don't get a tax deduction, there's larger gaps there. So lastly, and Steve Phillips did some research on this, on the political side, when you look at who the consultants are, it's no surprise that they're not, that they don't invest in Black engagement, both because they are culturally incompetent, and were they to do so, they would probably do it badly, and very often they do. So they get bad outcomes when they do it because they're not good at it. But secondly, they chase voters who are like themselves and like their donors. And so that leads them to chase white voters who actually disagree with our policy perspectives, rather than black and other people of color voters who, if they disagree, very often they're to our left. And so again, institutional racism, racial nepotism, and the racial wealth gap, I think, are three key reasons.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I would add that the black vote is taken for granted. I mean, the black vote votes as a block at a higher percentage than any other constituency, meaning 80–90% around economic and social justice issues. And so oftentimes that vote is taken for granted, and so resources are spent elsewhere. And the other thing is that obviously the point I made earlier is that our vote is aging, and so our power is going to decline if we don't pay attention to young African Americans replenishing and replacing that vote that is aging themselves, and so it's short-sighted. And finally, I think there's some issue of who's the new flavor of the week. African Americans have been key to the progressive movement. Now we have other people of color, communities of color that are rising, which is a good thing, and that doesn't have to be in counterposition to the African American vote, but sometimes it is.
This is Edward. I don't know if there's another question out there yet, but I just happened to see, and I actually retweeted it for those of you following Black Social Change, a report from Newsweek around a survey being done where 91% of black teens don't imagine, they just think racial discrimination is here to change, or here to stay, which is up from 33% in 1966. And of course, to your point around the fear of.
So why did she put it on Facebook instead of calling?
She didn't say it was about us. It was her.
Someone mute.
It's not her fault if other people are having the same experiences that she's having with her organization.
You could mute your phone if you're not responding to the question. And to that point, if there's a concern around this racial discrimination piece, but we know there's a need for some of those changes to come through policy, can you talk a little bit more about the engagement? Two things. One is the engagement of this next generation, and the other part is around engaging the last generation and some more intergenerational engagement around unifying around these causes that we believe in. We talk a lot about the newer movement building, but then there's also still some of the historic spaces that are occupied, such as the NAACP and other entities. And can you talk about how you are looking to bridge that generational movement around common causes? Let's open to anyone.
Okay. Let's. You want to start off, Aaron? Because I know you're doing a lot of work around this as well, and then we'll pick up other folks. Oh, did we lose Aaron? Okay, there we go.
Can you repeat the question again for me?
So if you can talk a little bit more about the intergenerational engagement, how you're bridging the new work and then some of the traditional movement building entities.
So I think one of the things is that the commitments that we make in our organizing strategy include a focus on having the infrastructure be intergenerational. So I'd say that's one thing. And when we do that, our meetings, our outreach, our facilitation, all of that should be led by not only elders but younger folks as well. The other thing that we are doing is I want to raise up the Southern Vision Alliance, which is a youth-led organization here, but one of the things that it does is it does physical sponsorship for the Tribe, which is a network of black leaders, younger leaders across the state of North Carolina, and the Queer People of Color Alliance. And so directly sort of engaging with them and supporting their work with some of the planning grant money to help us to stay in community as we build out the infrastructure. I think that's another important part of it, as well as a youth engagement strategy that's focused directly on building leadership in younger, because I don't like to use the word youth actually myself that much, but they just happen to be in the younger generation, but they are many times very powerful and very strong leaders. to also build a strategy that has ultimately sort of a youth-led civic engagement table where they are making the decisions about the funding, they are making decisions about the strategy, and they are sort of informing us about what they want to do, and to sort of shift the dynamic around that, I think, is also really important. And then another thing that we can do, or that I try to do, is also hire a lot of younger leaders. So there's one gentleman on my staff that's older than me, and then everybody else is much younger. And I think that that's also another way of moving an organization and being intergenerational, not only in your program work, but also like who are you hiring, who is in your organization, who's paid, who's making budget decisions. I think all of that is playing a role for us.
Okay. Other folks, either Charlene or Anthony? Yeah. Okay. The question was in terms of bridging the intergenerational gap in terms of Black turnout and Black political engagement. What are folks thinking about? Or we can move on to the next question as well.
Oh, I would just say that I think everything Erin says is right. It's got to be intentional. It doesn't happen automatically or naturally. I think the point about hiring staff people and leaders that are young and reflect who we're trying to target and turn out is essential. And also, you know, in our alliance, for example, we try to have a mix of groups, groups that are specifically focused on young people or younger people, and groups that also work with older constituencies.
Everybody, this is Terrence. I have a question for some of the panelists as well, just to interject quickly. Several of you talked about building independent Black political power and why that's important, and that political power not being aligned with a party or candidate. Can you just help us walk us through that a little bit and explain really what you mean by independent Black political power and why it's important now?
Mm-hmm.
Sure. This is Charlene. I can begin with that. So I definitely think it's a question that we, like the folks who are in Black Liberation Movement workspace right now, are wrestling with and figuring out how to define it. However, I do think that there are models of that that exist. If we talk about the work that has been done in Jackson, Mississippi, I think that's a key example. The work that Cooperative Jackson does and many other organizations do as really articulating an agenda that is grounded in not only dismantling the various systems that don't serve our people, but also reimagining what the economy can look like as a requirement for the liberation of our people and the transformation of the world. And what it even more plainly means is that we cannot align ourselves not simply by not putting the large D in front of anything that we do, or the R, or the or candidate's name, but even the values of said parties, the values of candidates that fall along party lines don't serve our people and our best interests. And so building that work means that the line for us, the bottom line for us, is always our people, and making sure, and at least speaking for BYP 100, particularly making sure that the people that we're talking about we center the folks who are traditionally and currently marginalized, and seeing that, situating ourselves in the belief that if we were to focus our issues in the work that we do around those who are on the margins of the margins, then everyone would benefit from that. If we were to have, you know, a guaranteed basic income, which comes out of our agenda to build Black futures, and of course the work of Black scholars like Sandy Darity, and so on. But if that were to happen, if it's coming from a Black political space advocating for a guaranteed basic minimum income, that's for everybody. It's not just for Black folk. And so that's how we see, how we're thinking about independent Black political power.
That's really great context, Charlene. I will say, too, for the Black Civic Engagement Fund, one of the reasons why we were started was because so often when we talk about the Black community or the Black electorate, it is often in service of a candidate that wasn't selected by our community, or often a set of issues that may not be core to the work that our communities are doing. And so it's very important for us to build the infrastructure necessary, the leaders that are necessary to actually shift the dialogue so that our voices are reflective. The things that we are supporting are reflective of the things that our communities need. So it's just another way to think about it.
That's really insightful, and I just have a quick, sort of tag-on question, because I just think it's really important to tie these pieces together. And this is Terrence. So, Charlene, thank you for that. It was really insightful. If we're talking about building independent Black political power, as you described it, and Cietta, you know this space really well. How do, in terms of on the philanthropy side, what does philanthropy need to do to get to that vision that Charlene is talking about? How do we organize, and this is for Ludovic as well, how do we organize philanthropy more? What needs to happen? Charlene, you talked about rapid response funding is critically important. How do we build the understanding of philanthropy and the infrastructure of philanthropy to get to what Charlene just described? And that's really for anybody, but
yeah, okay.
for funders,
Karen.
Yeah.
I'd like to just offer another thought and build on what I heard Charlene mention around Cooperation Jackson. It's sort of collective, cooperative economy work and envisioning a new economy. I think that one of the challenges with the building Black political infrastructure and relying on foundations to do that is relying on foundations to do that. And so I think one of the things that I think about a lot is how do we organize ourselves and organize our money, and how do we create an economy to sustain our work? And because we can't be independent if we are relying on if we're forever into the future relying on other people to fund our work at scale. And so I think one of the things that foundation resources can do is to specifically help address the question of sustainability, new economy, cooperative economic development in Black community. And I want to raise up Collective Courage, which is a history of Black economic thought and practice, as one place to sort of start a study around that question, because I do think that it's something that we really need to figure out, as well as engaging Black infrastructure that is not political as say we are on this telephone. The church is an example of that. The HBCU, the community development movement, that a lot of those entities have historically been engaged politically, but may not be as much, all of them, as we need at this particular moment. And so then to figure out the relationship to that and helping to build this new economy that we need to support our work.
Yeah, this is Anthony. The other thing I would say is that just reinforcing legitimacy of Black organizing and Black civic engagement. I mentioned in my presentation, when we first started the South American Project in California, I got the question almost every place I went, why would you do a Black project? Now, people don't ask that about any other constituency but us. So obviously I know that the Black Social Change Network, this is what you do, but understanding the legitimacy, the particular problems and issues and culture of the Black community, and the legitimacy of organizing, that doesn't exclude anybody else, that's not instead of anybody else, but has its own particular dynamics, I think is very important.
I'd add that I think a coalition of the willing is, in terms of donor and funder organizing, a coalition of the willing is the way to go. So I've seen too many philanthropic, progressive philanthropic interventions be focused on trying to get other people to change their practices, and not that many who were inwardly focused and did their own good practices and became models. So I think in terms of philanthropic organizing, anybody on the call who's willing to who's already doing good work in this space or willing to interrogate the work they're doing and move forward on it, it would behoove them to figure out what a likely small group of folks who are similarly aligned and figure out how to collaborate within that alignment, so that one, actual good work gets funded from whatever people can actually move now in the short term, and then when that is working, then we can point towards actual success and capacity building to get other people to jump in. So I'd focus on developing a coalition of willing philanthropic collaborators over trying to convince other people to do good work before there's existing collaborations doing that work now.
That's really great. Thank you.
Great. I just want to chime in here with some other questions from listeners. I'll read off a couple that are somewhat related. The first is, what kind of investment are wealthy Black folks making to these efforts? And then we have a specific question for Ludovic. Are you aware of networks of Black donors interested in supporting Black or people of color-oriented PACs?
So I can speak to a little bit of this, and then I think if there are individual donors in states that you guys want to talk to, we can, I can pivot to the states. So this is Cietta again. So in terms of individual wealthy Black donors, I would say we've had challenges so far figuring out how to get more of it. And I think Ludovic and both Anthony raised up some of the challenges in terms of that giving. I think that one of the things that is also a part of that is that we're actually talking about folks being political, and the security of giving in a C3 manner that's tax deductible and making your intent really clear in terms of your political efforts. You have to have a lot of financial freedom to do that in a lot of cases. And so I think we've seen those challenges as we started to try to build that. I think one of the ways we've been hopeful about this is that most of the groups that we invest in terms of our strategy are doing base building work. And for us that means giving folks the space to create a membership of donors, a membership that will eventually lead to individual donors, maybe not large individual donors, but smaller donations that will help them to become more sustainable as a thinking it through a strategy for us. But I think there's definitely a lot more work that we need to do to cultivate and sort of do some more donor advising, particularly with Black wealthy donors, and how they could give and support this work long term.
I agree with Cietta. I think that there's a core set of individual Black donors that are already funding this work, but there is a challenge around building a national network of Black donors who want to invest in building political infrastructure based on community-based organizations rather than based around an inspirational candidate. Specifically, there were a group of Black donors who were part of the Obama National Finance Committee, and you know, they had to figure out what they would do after they did that, and for most of them, it was hard to imagine, you know, after they helped to elect the first Black president of the United States, it was hard for most of them to pivot to then support individual Black leaders or individual smaller Black political entities. I think that was a challenge both in terms of scale and in terms of ideology for them. So that continues to be a struggle, and how we develop, how we fund Black political infrastructure, and what the balance is between Black donors of various ideologies, progressive non-Black donors who will mostly be white, big donors, and then much smaller giving from the regular community folks. How we balance all of that work, I think, is that's the thing that we are and need to be continuing trying to figure out.
Thank you. We have another question from the audience. Can someone speak about the legal counsel that public advocacy organizations use to ensure that C3s operate within federal and state laws as they engage in political advocacy? Who do you rely upon for counsel?
Well, in general, I think each of us have legal counsel. So I would say for our funds, one of the reasons why we established both a C3 and a C4 at the same time was so that we could create flexibility around tax statuses, and as we're advising other folks, that gives you a little bit more room. What I'm also noticing is that a number of organizations that are growing in this work are making certain that they have both C3, C4, and in many cases now, PACs, so that they can, they don't have as many of the issues. But I think legal counsel first, and I definitely have it, and everyone has it. I think the other piece is, you know, I will say this personally, I was a little squeamish about how political we could get on this conference call. And one of the things that, you know, why we created the collaborative funds were so that people who had challenges with that would be able to have more flexibility in terms of the conversations that they're having and not be limited. And to the extent that you can do political work, there is so much room around what C3s are capable of doing in terms of their infrastructure. And I think we get nervous primarily because we get targeted more often than others. But there is incredible flexibility. And I think, you know, Aaron, you should talk a little bit about that because you guys do very great targeting work that is right up to the line. And Anthony as well. But I think that the thing that I would take home from this is that there are a number of ways that you can do this to be flexible, and thinking about your tax status as a limitation is part of the challenge that we have in terms of doing political work. And I think we just sort of need to open up what are the possibilities, and are definitely the conversations that we're having more frequently nationally with folks. And I think even Charlene, you guys are starting a C4 as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So yeah, I can respond in one way. So we do have a lawyer. We also have Anita Earls on our board, and we rely on support from the donor table, who has a lot of legal counsel. Another thing, though, beyond just a staff knowing what to do, are the organizations. And so we've brought down the Alliance for Justice is the organization that we've worked with the most in training partners in ourselves about the roles that the C3s can play and that C4s and that PACs can play, and where they can't work together and are not allowed to. And even on this call, I mean, the main thing that we've been talking about a multiple range of issues. We've not said vote for one person or the other, vote for one party on the other. So I think that, you know, and that's why the issue advocacy work is so important, because you can do issue advocacy work up into the election and even voter guides if they're on multiple issues. And because we're under assault on all different types of fronts, I think that, you know, there's a natural fit and way for us to do that work. So
yeah, I think that's right. This is Anthony. We have a C3 and a C4. The Alliance for Justice is great. They've done a bunch of trainings with us. So we have a C3 lawyer and a C4 lawyer, and we do lots of webinars and training sessions with all our groups on both sides to make sure people understand the lines and limits and what they can do.
Thank you, everyone. We have about 10 minutes remaining on this call, and I'm told that there are a ton of questions out there, probably more than we can answer in those 10 minutes. But what we'll do is we'll compile as many of those questions as we can in a document, and we'll invite all the speakers to respond in kind. And we'll add that Q&A to a kind of after the show resource that we will, once those questions are responded to by the panel. I'd like for us to invite you all to think about some closing thoughts that you'd want to impart upon this audience, including how might funders be more strategic? What would you like to see them do as it relates to your work and advancing this topic of Black social engagement? And then also closing with Terrence, providing some more information kind of as a wrap-up regarding the Black Social Change Funders Network.
As a follow-up question related to what Edward just said, one of the audience members would like you to speak to some of the challenges that you faced related to funding as you try to diversify your support from private foundations to individual support and other forms of support, and specifically what type of staffing can private foundations support to build funding capacity?
I'll let the panelists start. Is anybody prepared to answer that? If not, I can talk a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of thoughts. I mean, one, in terms of just private foundations support, funding staff position that does that. That helps us think about how to develop an independent financial base. Quite often, the foundation funding is project specific and not about general support or not about general organization development, and certainly necessarily about funding. So grants targeted toward how we can develop a broader independent source of funding is critical. And I know we've done lots and are doing lots of experiments how to develop independent funding sources beyond foundations. That includes, we think now that we've got a large enough mass donor voter base to try to build a mass small donor base of 10, 20, 30,000 people is one thing we're doing. We've done some experiments with social entrepreneurship. Are there businesses that we can do to raise money to fund the C4 and C4 work? So lots of experimentation going on that front.
Thanks, Anthony.
This is Aaron. I want to ditto everything Anthony just said. He just took like several things off my list. And then there are, foundations do have, for some anyways, endowment funds and can make program-related investment. And so to the point around building independent, sustainable economic development strategies that support our political work, yeah, I'm aware of entities in my area who are starving because they're not a part of the economic development that's happening and the gentrifying that's happening. Well, how can foundations be a place where we can build the economic development and the membership work simultaneously, and that provides jobs. It just does so many other things. So I just want to name that as something that I would be really interested in hearing from folks that do that type of work.
I ditto what Anthony, this is Ludovic, what Anthony and Aaron just said. The starting off on a basic level, for those of you in foundations, making sure you're doing multi-year general operating support is a start, because not everybody is, like Anthony said, many folks want to do project funding, then they're not paying for the building that the staffer's in, and when you're doing short-term funding, basically your funding groups, part of your funding to groups is preparing all the reports for the foundation. They're not able to do the work that you're actually funding them to do. So having some basic philanthropic best practices around long-term general operating support can actually give some space to groups to figure out all the other more complicated stuff that is actually much more important than them having to figure out how to jump through all the multiple philanthropic hoops they need to do to get the funds. And to put to make a point of that, and so an example of what folks could do is if folks are funding in a region, they could work to standardize their application processes. So the organizations don't need to fill out 5 or 10 different application processes. So there's some basic philanthropic stuff that we could do to make the lives of the grantees much easier.
So I would say, and I don't know if Charlene, you had something, one of the things that we have been trying to do through the Black Civic Engagement Fund is really think about allowing people the space to make mistakes. I think a lot of times with philanthropy that's challenging, but some of the projects that our folks are doing are really creative and innovative, and they will not be successful this time around, and that's okay. But we need to invest in them and their ability to have space to do that over time, and push as funders to get folks up to the levels that they need to be in to have really strong, successful programs. But it also allows us the space to figure out like where the gaps are and what training and support they need so that we can fund them also in the best way to support their work. So just thinking about that, and I know that is in itself is controversial, that not every project that we fund will be successful, or not every organization will be. But I think that a lot of other organizations are allowed to make mistakes, and there aren't questions about whether or not we should continue to fund them and make sure they're viable.
Hi, this is Charlene. I would love to add on. That's exactly what I wanted to contribute, Cietta, around risk-taking. And I believe that it's really important to invest early. And the Arcus Foundation was our first funder. And they invested very, very early in our work. And they didn't know what we would become. I'm not sure we knew what we would become, right? We had a vision, have a vision, and have an amazing community of leaders and organizers. But they invested extremely early on in us, and I think that's important. Is that when you, particularly in the movement space I operate in, where there are young Black folks who have the will to build a political institution or build an organization, is that you invest early and invest, as other folks have said, with general operating support, and not for it to be simply project-based. Because in many ways, folks are figuring out how they can harness their work in a most strategic way. At the same time, we're talking about folks who've been doing this work for a very long time. I've been in this work for over 12 years at this point, and this is the first organization that I've led. And I've learned a lot, and I've also had a lot of support in order to do that. And so invest early and take risk, particularly knowing that there are organizations that have missions that have been around for decades and have not fulfilled their mission. And so to me, to invest over and over again in organizations and institutions that have not fulfilled their mission and have not made great gains at their mission, towards their mission, that is a major risk to take every year. And so to think about the folks who are moving things on the ground, be it unseating state's attorneys or ensuring that a new police department doesn't receive more funding as our folks did in New Orleans, or any of the several victories that we've had nationally as a movement, that's not a risky investment. It's a sound investment if we're serious about social justice in our country and in this world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to tease out one of the things that Charlene said just really quickly in terms of the lessons we learned in that. Charlene is a perfect example. BYP 100 is a perfect example of an organization that started, and would we have seen some of the advances that we saw in Chicago without that? I think the other lessons we learned is that if you give people space and to plan, they create really amazing programs. But we also learned, the gaps that I learned specifically on that were that we haven't invested in the leadership pipeline in a way where folks can get trained and have space to learn all of the different components that we expect of them. And so part of that too is, I think in terms of the lesson we're learning, is we're now going to be convening our folks and giving them training, leadership development, time with each other, learning from other states like what Anthony is doing, how to build collective capacity the way Aaron is doing, so that they can build stronger programs over time, and that we would not have known that if we had cut off some of these grantees early in their investment cycle.
Thank you. This is Terrence. I just want to add something really quickly. I think this has been a really powerful and amazing discussion with an amazing group of funders and advocates, social justice leaders. So on behalf of the Black Social Change Funders Network, we're happy to partner with AFP and all of you. And I just want to quickly summarize her need for more general operating support, more flexible funding, particularly rapid response funding, allowing groups to make mistakes, build a coalition of the willing that can align funding and set an example for other funders, think about supporting groups that are moving things on the ground, give people the space to plan, and invest in the leadership pipeline. These are all great suggestions, advice from your learned experience. And so, with the work ahead, let's continue the dialogue and let's continue to think about how we can work together, pass on these lessons, and as you said a little bit, how can we build this coalition of the willing to really align funding to get to some of the change that we talked about. And that's a really high aspirational goal, because as funders we know it's not always easy to align our funding, but let's figure out how to do it. So I'm just putting that out there as a challenge to all of us as funders. And finally, I want to say, if anyone's interested in joining the listserv, getting updates on the Black Social Change Funders Network, feel free to send me an email. I'll get you on our listserv. And my email address is my name, terrence.pitts@gmail.com. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for being a part of this call. Again, there will be resources that will be made available that you all can take advantage of. Reach out to all the speakers. We encourage you to research their work, reach out to them, support them, spread the word about this, as well as just stay tuned to the continuing work of the Black Social Change Funders Network as a growing force in connecting us all around social issues and around Black-led civic engagement. So again, you will all receive a survey. We ask that you fill it out to help us be better in responding to what you're looking for, and we'll continue to share and grow stronger together. So thank you all. Thank you, Cietta. Thank you, all the panelists, for this great conversation. The event will be made available at the AbbVie Knowledge Center within the next few hours for you to review and to share. Thank you all and have a great day.
That was a good call.
Yay.
Wasn't it? I think it was okay.
It was. And it's the beginning. So.
I didn't miss anything.